All right, so let's get going on today's class. So what we're going to be doing today is we are going to be continuing our look at the special topic of picture perception that we began last time. We began last time by taking a look at some definitions of what a picture is, basically going down to first principles, trying to figure out what exactly is it that we're studying when we're studying this ability that humans have in perceiving pictures. And one thing that we made the point of illustrating is that picture perception is a really recent development in the history of humanity, and especially humanity's development of the human mind. Yep. Yeah, absolutely, please. So it's a relatively new development in the development of, or in the abilities of the human mind. So the human mind was basically fully formed in the sense of it was what constitutes a human mind had evolved, was formed about 160,000 years ago. And as we saw, picture perception only popped up about 50,000 years ago. So, one of the things that's very important to keep in mind when we talk about the human mind is that it actually is an ancient formation. It actually is an ancient way of interacting and representing your environment. And as we're going to see later in the course, that oftentimes has really profound implications when we encounter things that did not exist when we were developing our or evolving our human mind. So pictures is the first one that we encountered on this, but we're going to see that the effect of media, social media, the ability to access many resources almost instantaneously, a lot of these things are also affecting our minds because we weren't optimized to live in this world. We were optimized to live in a different type of environment. All right, so what we're going to do today is we're going to continue our look at picture perception. I put this video up because on the flip side, this is also a theory of picture creation as well. So we don't talk explicitly about the ability of humans to actually create these images and create these pictures. But basically, the principles that define or explain how we perceive pictures can then also be extended very easily to explain how do we create these pictures. So we're going to start off with a very brief recap of where we got to last time in picture perception. So why study picture perception? What is a picture? Definitions and objections. We went over my poor definition from 2006. And then we took a look at Gibson's definition from 1953, which was the point-by-point projection definition. And we'll see why that one doesn't quite work. And then we'll see an answer, a reply to that definition by Goodman in 1968. And then we'll see Gibson's reply to Goodman and Gibson 1953 when we take a look at Gibson's definition from 1971. And then that one will be sort of our betterest definition that we are going to encounter. But we are going to end with a final objection, which is metaphoric images, which we will see that none of these theories can actually account for everything in our ability to perceive pictures. All right, so just by way of quick recap, as we saw last time, our human minds, if you think of them as a product of evolution, have been developing for a long time. And about 180 years ago, we were done. And then about 50,000 years ago, we find evidence of the earliest cave paintings. So that means that our minds were not evolved or developed to perceive pictures. Pictures were not part of our environment while our minds were being formed. So it is a bit of a mystery. It's an excellent test of what our minds are actually doing to basically put them in this artificial situation, which is looking at pictures and then seeing how it performs and how it solves that novel task that our minds were not engineered to solve. And then we took a look at the fact that pictures have very many sort of nuances and intricacies to them, in the idea that different objects in the real world can be represented in pictures in different ways. So these are all a picture of a tiger. However, they are very, very different representations of a tiger. We took a look at the implications of Rene Magritte's treachery of images and just how it calls into sharp contrast just how easily we process pictures, that oftentimes we forget that we're looking at a picture, to the extent in our English language, if somebody said, hey, what is this? You'd be like, well, that's a pipe. And as Scott McCloud pointed out, no, it's not a pipe. It's a picture of a pipe. It's actually not a picture of a pipe. It's a drawing of a picture of a pipe. It's actually not a picture of a pipe. It's a drawing of a picture of a projection of a pipe, so on and so forth. And then we got to my good sounding, but ultimately bad definition of what a picture is. The idea that it's a non-propositional visual representation on a 2D plane, meaning that what we got there on the left is a picture of the Mona Lisa. What we got there on the right is a representation of the Mona Lisa, but it's a propositional representation and hence not a picture of the Mona Lisa. So it was a very good definition of what a picture is not, but it had nothing to say about what a picture actually is. And we talked about the issues with that last time. And then we took a look at how images can represent many different categories of things. Things that you can find in the real world. So images can represent things that exist in our world, such as lions. It can represent things that do not exist in our world, such as unicorns. It can represent things that are readily seen in the real world, like a basket of fruit. It can also represent things that are not seen, such as thoughts that we have. And it can also represent things that are impossible to see, such as invisibility. So pictures have this ability to represent many of these things that just do not happen in the real world, are impossible to perceive in the real world, and also things that do happen in the real world and are possible to perceive in the real world. So if you want a complete understanding of picture perception, you have to be able to explain how we can perceive all of those different aspects of a picture. We went on to talk about how pictures, very importantly, can represent space. And you can do a representation of 0 dimensions as a point, 1 dimension as a line, 2 dimensions here as a square, 3 dimensions as a cube. And again, these are all on a 2-dimensional plane. So that square is really the only thing that is a square that is on the 2-dimensional plane. Everything else is not what it is, but again, can represent those actual concepts. And then we also talked about how it can represent 4 dimensions, especially if you have a moving picture, where this is a projection of a 4-dimensional tesseract into our 3-dimensional world as it spins, and then that projection of that 4-dimensional object into our 3-dimensional world is now projected onto a 2-dimensional plane, and yet we can still infer the 3-dimensional structure, even though the idea of how that is created by a 4-dimensional object spinning in a 4-dimensional space is a very confusing to our minds that have developed in a 3-dimensional world. All right, and then we also saw how, in addition to space, images can also represent time. So here we have a time-lapse photograph that we readily understand is this particular individual girl in motion, rather than a series of clones of a girl standing at different positions. And we can see how that representation of time can tell us what happened in this case. So we have a static image that lets us know, yes, she threw a ball, she was very happy with the results, and she was celebrating afterwards. So our better definition that we introduced last time was by Gibson. And this one was a really difficult one to kind of unpack. The language on this is so dense. But basically what he was saying in this definition is that if you want a picture of something, a faithful picture, something that represents something else, then you have to have a surface that you process. So you have a delimited surface, that's your picture surface, that's the canvas that you're drawing on, so processed, i.e. painted on, or however you're going to make markings on that 2-dimensional surface, that it yields a sheaf of light rays to a given point. It recreates an optic array to that given point, which is the same as the optic array from the original scene to a given point. So basically, the points on your picture surface reproduce the optic array that would have been produced if you were there in the real world looking at the real object. So the core of his definition is that point-by-point projection theory, and this is underlined by perspective projection. So again, perspective projection is the geometry that decides what light enters your eye, what information gets projected onto your retina. So the ability to use perspective geometry is something that our minds do, something that our minds have been programmed to do, because that is the way that light enters our sensors. And we took a look at Brunelleschi and talked about how he outlined the principles of perspective, discovered the ideas of perspective geometry, basically taught it to everybody in the Renaissance. And lastly, we kind of took a look at exactly what did Gibson mean when he was talking about that sheaf of light rays, that ambient optic array that gets reproduced. And basically, if you have an object like a tree in the real world and you have an observer, you can put a picture surface between the two. And then every point on that tree, as it travels through the picture surface to the observer, will intersect that picture surface at a point. And if those corresponding points in the real world, if you match them up on the picture surface, you will end up with a picture of that tree. And the reason, according to Gibson's projection theory, that it is a picture of a tree is because the shape of that cone, the shape of that ambient optic array cone, is the same in the real world as it is in the picture. And that's why that picture is the depiction of a tree, because the pattern of light that you get from looking at the real world is duplicated in the pattern of light that you get from looking at that tree. And then I had some examples of that to show you, to kind of give you an idea of real world examples of this projection theory. But a much better example was suggested. So this is, it should be playing, but it's not playing. All right, so we saw this video. Oh, it's struggling. We saw this video last time. You have to go back one and try it again. Nope. So we saw this video last time where basically there was an animated scene and then there was a window that went into the real world. And as the person passed in front of the window and back, their real image would come up, and then they would go back to the cartoon image, and everything lined up. So the point-by-point projection theory is basically that idea that if you want to make a picture, everything has to line up. Everything on the picture surface has to line up with where it would have been if you were looking out at the real world. All right, so the point-by-point projection theory does have objections. It doesn't hold up as a theory of picture perception. So there are a few that we're going to go through. So the first objection to Gibson's point-by-point projection definition comes from very simplistic images, like line drawings. So line drawings are drawings that we very readily, very easily can recognize as depictions of other objects. So I'll give you an example right here. So this is a line drawing by Roland Wright, and it's very apparent that this is an airplane, probably some sort of glider, but just the lines that are present in this image is enough for us to see it and recognize it as a particular object. And importantly, as a contradiction to Gibson's theory, here there is no point-to-point correspondence whatsoever. There is no, well, not whatsoever, but there is no point-to-point correspondence in terms of brightness. So this is all just one brightness. This is all the same level of brightness. In the real world, no real object has the same level of brightness across its entire surface. This does not have any point-to-point correspondence in terms of color. So it is completely white. Nothing in this world, if it's illuminated by a real light source, could have that property. And so on and so forth. You could elucidate many things that this image is missing. and yet at the same time, you can perceive it as this airplane. So if it's a faithful representation, which means that you can perceive it, but it doesn't use point-by-point projection because most of the points are missing from this picture, then we can't accept Gibson's definition of point-by-point projection theory as the reason why pictures do what they can do. All right, other objections to this one, and you might have thought about this because we covered this when we were looking at invariance, caricatures. So to the extent that a caricature is a representation of an individual, to the extent that this caricature on the left is a picture of Ariana Grande, and most of us, again, accepted this when I showed this previously, and I said, hey, what is this a picture of? Nobody said, well, that's not a picture of anybody. That person doesn't exist. No, all of us were basically in agreement. Yeah, that's Ariana Grande. But you can see that the point-by-point projection theory cannot explain why caricatures work. Because if you were to take those two pictures and line them up, unlike the AHA video, where all the edges on one side would line up with the edges on the real world projection, here, those edges would not line up whatsoever. And everything would not correspond point by point, which is what Gibson claimed was required in order for a picture to be a faithful picture. So that was Gibson in 1954, was it, or 58? I think it was 54. So that turned out to not be a good definition of what a picture actually is. So now we'll get to maybe an even better definition. And this is from Nelson Goodman. And Nelson Goodman kind of came from it from the other side of the spectrum. So we had Gibson coming from it and saying that, well, pictures depend upon perspective geometry. And because they depend upon perspective geometry, we need that point-by-point correspondence in order for a picture to be viewed as faithful. Goodman went on the other side and said, well, maybe perspective geometry is not required. Maybe that's not what pictures are about at all. And perspective geometry is just one way of doing them. So Goodman came up with this idea that representations are pictures that function in somewhat the same way as descriptions. So almost like what I had said in my really, really bad definition, except Goodman does a way better job of actually depicting or defining what a picture is. So he goes, representation then are pictures that function in somewhat the same way as descriptions. Just as objects are classified by means of or under various verbal labels, so also are objects classified by or under various picture labels. So he was basically saying that pictures function somewhat the same way as verbal language does. Pictures function in somewhat the same way as descriptions actually do. So the way that the picture works and the way that you can understand that something is a representation of a real object is basically by decoding a language that the picture is using, a visual language that the picture is using to communicate. So the core of Nelson Goodman's definition is known as the symbol theory of pictorial information. And basically, it's saying that pictures are composed of symbols, just the same way that language is composed of symbols. And we understand pictures basically by reading the symbols that are in a picture, and that's what allows us to perceive something as a picture. So before we get to there, I just want to make sure that we kind of understand the core idea of this theory. And the core idea of this theory is that we have certain features, visual features, that are coded into pictures as symbols. And this is the same way that certain features or things or concepts are coded into our language in a certain way as well. So to give you an example of what implications this has, let's say that we have these two things in the real world. And we as English-speaking people have decided at some point, we decided that, hey, that thing on the left and things like that thing on the left, we're gonna call those dog. We're gonna make the sound dog when we look at these things, and when I say the word, when I say the sound dog, you're going to understand that it means this. And then we decided as English speaking people that that thing on the left and things like that thing, sorry, the thing on the right and things like that thing on the right, that's going to be cat. And the symbol, the verbal symbol that is going to stand for that is the sound cat. And the written symbol that is going to stand for that is the written CAT. So that's the underpinnings of language. And basically, what makes this different, or what makes this, well, basically one feature of this that's important to Goodman's theory is that this assignment is arbitrary. There is no reason that things like that thing on the left needed to be called dog. And there's no reason that a thing like that thing on the right needed to be called cat. It just as easily could have been that we decide that the thing on the left, that's what we're going to call cat. And the thing on the right, that's what we're going to call dog. And then if this is the world that we lived in, when I said cat, you would have thought, oh yeah, furry, fluffy little creature full of love. And when I say dog, you would have thought, oh, murderous demon that lives in my house, right? But you would understand it. And we would teach this to children. We would hold up pictures of that creature on the left, and we would say, what is this? And the little child would say, it's a banana. And we'd be like, no, cat. This is cat. And eventually they would be like, oh yeah, that's cat. And the other thing is dog. So our language predominantly is arbitrary. Our language predominantly is built up of symbols where we as a society just agreed, for really no good reasons, that that symbol, dog, is going to refer to that thing. And that symbol over there, cat, is going to refer to that thing. Now, I mentioned that it's arbitrary. I will say there's a good reason why certain words are a certain length, right? So you wouldn't want words that are often used like the, of, to be super long, because that would make communication very difficult. So there are some constraints in terms of an effective language. But again, the basic idea that that thing had to be called dog, you can get rid of that idea just by looking cross-culturally and saying, well, other languages don't call it dog, right? There's other words for that thing that people have agreed on. So if there was something inherent in being that thing that linked it somehow necessarily to the sound dog, then language wouldn't be arbitrary. But really, you can call it dog, you can call it chien, you could call it, I don't know if I roll my R's or don't roll my R's for this, but you can call it perro, you can call it many different things. All those words mean that thing, but they're just arbitrary decisions that we have made as we developed our languages. Now, there are some words. I don't want to make blanket statements without addressing some of the exceptions. There are some words that do have kind of a tied association to the actual real thing in the real world. So these are words that are known as onomatopoeias, and these are words where the word actually sounds like the thing that it's representing. So the word buzz. The word buzz sounds like buzz. We call a cuckoo clock because the sound it makes is cuckoo, cuckoo, right? So those are words that are not as arbitrary, but those are few and far in between. And again, we could get away with words that don't sound like this or aren't onomatopoeias. So we could say, well, do you hear that droning? Do you hear that droning sound of that bee? And you mean like, oh, the buzz? Because that's actually what a bee sounds like. And you'd be like, yeah, the droning. So those are some exceptions, but generally the words are arbitrarily assigned to the concepts. And one last example to kind of drive this home, we have the word for short, and short is actually longer than the word for long. So that makes no sense whatsoever if we had a relationship where the words had to sort of match what they were talking about, because you would have figured that short would be a much shorter word where long would be a much longer word. But again, we don't have that associations. So the idea is that these symbols stand in, and we agree that they stand in, and we form a language by agreeing that they stand in for these concepts, for these external, the external realities. And then Goodman was arguing that, well, the same way we do that for spoken language, we actually do it for pictures. And pictures are basically like a written visual language. So what are some of the maybe components of this visual language? What are some of the phrases or words in this visual language? So we've seen this painting before. This is the School of Athens by Raphael. And one of the things that, I'll just point this out just real quick. One of the easiest things to draw, one of the first things you learn to draw if you're learning to draw in perspective is tiles. Tiles are one of the easiest things. I could teach everybody in here how to draw tiles in perspective correctly in about 2 minutes. If you take a look at how many pictures in the Italian Renaissance had tiles in the pictures, it is just an astounding number. Even of times when they made up like ancient depictions of like the Annunciation. Apparently, wherever Mary lived when she found out that she was going to be the mother of Jesus, had tiles on the floor, according to the Renaissance. So they love tiles because it's one of the first things you learn how to draw. So let's get back to the visual language. One thing that Goodman would say is that size in the picture is part of the visual language. So how big is something actually in the picture? And position in the picture is part of the visual language. So where in the picture is it? And he would say something like, if you have a certain size of an object and it is low in the picture plane, that is a visual language for it being closer to you than something that is smaller in the on the picture surface, but higher on the actual picture plane, right? So here we have one individual who is taking up the entire ellipse, right? So the one, oops, wrong way. We have one individual here, he's taking up the entire ellipse, but his place in the picture plane, you can see that ellipse starts low on the picture surface. So according to Goodman's theory, our mind would say, okay, we have learned that size, but low on the picture surface, is the same approximate size as a much smaller image, but higher on the picture surface. So big but low on the picture surface equals smaller but higher on the picture surface, and that's just part of the visual language that we learn to speak. And visual language really comes out sometimes when you start talking about metaphorical images. So things like The Persistence of Memory by Salvador Dali. This is something that can make a lot more sense to you as you learn about surrealism, as you learn about different sort of artistic techniques and metaphors. So a lot of people might look at this and say, well, you know, we got some melting clocks. So I guess this is a really hot environment, and clearly not hot enough to kill ants who have made their home in another clock. So we got a clock that's infested with ants and a whole bunch of melting clocks. Interesting picture. Other people, Goodman would argue, who have learned the language of surrealism and have learned how to correctly interpret that language would look at this and they would say, well, no, this is about the fading of memory and how over time it gets distorted. And, you know, these clocks started off as rigid, but as time goes on, things just kind of melt away. And you would understand that if you spoke the language. So again, the idea is that you would understand a picture if you spoke the visual language of that picture. So something like a Renaissance painting uses one visual language. Something like a surrealistic painting uses another visual language. We have these metaphorical images like Alan Gilbert's All Is Vanity. So again, the point that this picture is trying to make, what it's trying to represent, the idea that, you know, vanity or the pursuit of vanity is somehow linked to death. That is something that would be readily apparent if you understood this visual language, if you were trained and spoke in this visual language. And one of the implications of this visual language symbol theory of picture perception is the idea that these different ways of depicting things, these different artistic schools or artistic approaches, artistic techniques, they are all equally good at representing information in a picture. They are all equally good at making a picture. It's just that if we are confused, it's because we don't speak the language, right? We don't speak the language as well as we might the Renaissance paintings that we might have grown up with and seen a lot of. So one of the implications of this is, let's say that you lived in a world where every picture that you ever saw was drawn in the Cubism style. So every picture you ever saw was drawn in the Cubism style. So you were reading as a baby, as a child, you were being read. Let's say that you were being read Alice in Wonderland. That's a bad example. Let's say that you were being read Goldilocks and the Three Bears. And whoever's reading the book to you says, oh, Goldilocks found a cottage. And they show you a picture of Goldilocks, and her nose is on the left side of her face. She's got eyes that go the other way. Her head is detached from her body. She's drawn in a Cubist style. The cottage is drawn in a Cubist style. The bears are drawn in a Cubist style. The porridge is drawn in a Cubist style. And as they go through, and they keep pointing out, look, Goldilocks is going into the cottage. And when she goes into the cottage, she sees 3 chairs. See, look, 1, 2, 3. We got 3 chairs. You're learning the language. You're learning that visual language so that you can understand it. One of the implications of Goodman's theory is that if you learned Cubism, if you became fluent in Cubism, if you were able to decode Cubism as readily as you do perspective pictures, for example, then if you saw a picture like this, Guernica by Pablo Picasso, you take a look at this and you'd be like, oh, yeah, I know what's going on here. And you wouldn't be confused. You wouldn't be looking at this, trying to decode it piece by piece, looking at it going like, I'm not entirely, I think that's a horse over there. And maybe we got in the center there like a floating head or something. And there's somebody with their arms up that's clearly yelling. You wouldn't have those difficulties. You would take a look at this, and if you spoke the language, you would be like, well, this is clearly some sort of war. This is clearly a battle. And then when somebody explained to you that, it was a representation of the bombing of Guernica during the Spanish Civil War, you'd be like, oh yeah, totally. I can see that 100%. That is a war. That is people getting bombed. There's fire, there's destruction. I can see it because you speak the language. And if you're looking at this like me and having a hard time understanding it, it's because you don't speak Cubism as well as you speak some other picture languages. All right, so that is the symbol theory of pictorial information. Pictures are made up of symbols, and we decode those symbols, and that's how we perceive pictures. So, objections to this. So, the big objection to the symbol theory of pictorial information has to do with the status of perspective. Because one of the arguments that Goodman makes is that the attribution of symbols in a visual language is like the attribution of symbols in a spoken language. That is, it's mostly arbitrary. We choose cat to reference the concept of felines. We choose dog to represent the concept of canines, but we didn't need to. We could have chosen any other language. In that case, the question becomes, well, what is going on with perspective? Is the use of perspective in pictures a convention? Is the use of perspective in pictures just another visual language? Now, it could have been a visual language that was spread far and wide, maybe because of the influence of Western culture on the world, and we brought this visual language to the world, and the world was like, yeah, this is I like this language, and all the books that were printed basically had perspective pictures in it. We live in a photographic world. So all photographs are taken with perspective geometry. Could it be that we're just really, really good at understanding perspective pictures and they're just a convention? And if we lived in that world where children grew up with cubism, then cubism paintings and pictures would look exactly as understandable to us as perspective pictures. So according to Goodman's theory, perspective is just another convention. It's just another language. And much like languages, you can't say that English is somehow better at describing the world than Italian. And you can't say that Italian is better at describing the world than Chinese. It might be better at some things, right? You have those languages where it's like, well, there's 27 words for snow in this language because snow is very important for these people. But in general, you don't have a language that is better at describing the world than other languages that have been invented. What about perspective? Is perspective somehow better or different than any other picture convention that we have developed? If not, that would lend evidence to Goodman's claims of the symbol theory of pictorial information. But if it is different, that means that it's not necessarily a convention, which throws doubt on this symbol theory of pictorial information. So with that being said, there are some that say that perspective is not a convention. Fast forward 2 years and we get Gibson 1960. So Gibson 1960 says, it does not seem reasonable to assert that the use of perspective in paintings is merely a convention to be used or discarded by the painter as he chooses. When the artist transcribes what he sees upon a two-dimensional surface, he uses perspective geometry of necessity. So Gibson was saying that when you take the intersection of that optic array and project it onto a 2D surface, that is perspective geometry of necessity. So that is some sort of fundamental fundamental way of representation that is not arbitrary, it's not chosen, it's built into the physics of our environment. So Gibson would say that perspective is not a convention. And then this little back and forth, I just love. So then Goodman came back and started off with in diametric contradiction to what Gibson says. So not just, hey, you know what, I got this new theory or this new point to make, but basically completely contradicting what Gibson was just saying. The artist who wants to produce a spatial representation that the present day Western eye will accept as faithful. So the artist who wants to produce a spatial representation that a person who grew up with perspective pictures will accept as a good picture must defy the laws of geometry. So this kind of gauntlet throwing was something that I did not know I inadvertently got involved in, because in diametric contradiction to what Goodman says, my PhD thesis was actually all about the nature of the laws of perspective and which ones hold up and where they hold up and which ones break down and where they break down. And basically, long story short, we don't have a perspective calculator built into our brain. Sorry, built into our mind. I was sometimes do that. We don't have a perspective calculator built into our mind. But what we do have is we have a function in there that approximates perspective geometry under most conditions and falls apart under extreme conditions, conditions that our mind was not made to exist in, aka when we're looking at a picture. So we had this approximation to perspective programmed into our mind by 180,000 years ago. And 50,000 years ago, when pictures came along, it basically piggybacked on that idea. And our approximation was like, hey, we're pretty good for most pictures. So anywhere where you see white in that figure there, that's where we're perceiving things as correct. But anywhere you see the dark grays or the light grays, that's where we are not perceiving these tiles as being correct. So we have this approximation. So it's not like we totally ignored perspective, but we have approximation that breaks down at the edges. All right, shameless plug. Anyways, back to if it is a convention or is not a convention. So if perspective is a convention, if it is just an arbitrary way of representing the world, then there have to be other conventions. And importantly, there has to be other conventions that are just as good as perspective. So if perspective is a convention and it's just an arbitrary way of doing pictures, then there has to be first other conventions, and they have to be just as good. So one person that pointed out some other conventions was Kepes. One thing that you guys will discover, and this is something that nobody ever told me when I was going through my psychology academic career, you will not know how to pronounce a lot of researchers' names until you meet them at a conference. So there is no pronunciation guide to these. And I know so many times students ask me, they're like, well, how do you pronounce this researcher's name? And I was like, I don't know. You need to meet them in a convention. And then they'll be like, oh, yes, it's not Zionk. It's pronounced Zions. It rhymes with science. And that's how you actually pronounce it. So Kepes, I'm assuming. But what they said was Chinese and Japanese painters assigned to linear perspective, that's the typical perspective, a diametrically opposite role from that given it by Western painters. So here we have another diametrically opposite role. In their system, parallel lines converge as they approach the spectator. They open up the space instead of closing it. So what he is saying, what they are saying here is that Chinese and Japanese painters, they do the opposite. They developed a system, another convention, where they do the opposite of what Western painters were doing. So instead of lines going off into the distance converging, lines that go off into the distance, they diverge. And instead of lines coming towards the observer diverging, lines coming towards the observer converge in this inverse perspective. So I looked for some examples of this, and they were actually not as prevalent as I would have thought, but I wanted to include this one just because I love the Great Wave of Kanagawa. So I thought I'd put it up there. It's nice and pretty. But I did find some examples. So we have one here of this different convention, this opposite convention from a linear perspective. So here we have Lady Murasaka writing at her desk. And the desk there is not rendered in linear perspective. That desk is not drawn in linear perspective. That desk, if you take a look at the lines, they actually don't converge and they don't diverge. They're drawn in what's known as parallel perspective. So that's another convention. So in this case, the argument is being made that if you grew up looking at Japanese art, so if you were a Japanese person in the 14th and 15th century, you would understand inverse perspective. And if you then went to the Renaissance, you would find their pictures confusing because you wouldn't speak the linear perspective language, you would speak the inverse or maybe parallel perspective language as well. There was another example that I found, and this is the Night Revels of Hang Jija, and it's a 12th century reproduction. So this one was a scroll, and the part that we want is way over here. So we'll back it up a little bit, and then I'm going to pretend like I'm actually doing something here, enhancing. There we go. So if you take a look at the table there, the table is drawn in, this one is actually drawn in very subtle inverse perspective. So that table, if it was drawn in linear perspective, the edges that move away from you, they should be getting closer together on the picture plane. They should be converging. However, if you trace those out, they're actually very subtly diverging. So again, this is an inverse perspective. It's a different convention that was used in this different culture. And we also have examples of that in Western culture. So in the Renaissance, or maybe just before the Renaissance, this is the Annunciation Church of St. Clement in Ohrid. And if you take a look at many of the blocks in this painting, you can see that they diverge. So in the upper left there, that structure that is being covered by the angel wing, if you take a look at the two edges, they actually diverge as they move away from the observer. If you take a look at the armrest right next to the saint, if the saint was going to take their hand that is upright and place it down on the armrest, that also diverges. It doesn't converge as it goes off into the distance, it diverges. And if you take a look at the stage that the saint is seated on, same thing there. Those actually diverge. So we seem to have a different system that goes completely opposite of what linear perspective does. And it was a well-developed system, and it was used in paintings across the world. And it seems to be this viable alternative to linear perspective. This inverse perspective or parallel perspective seems to be something that is just a different way of communicating, a different visual language to communicate in a picture. So, is there an argument against this? Well, the argument against this is the idea of whether or not there is a key difference between linear perspective and inverse perspective. Is there something that linear perspective, the typical geometry where parallel lines converge as they go away from you, does it have some sort of advantage that cannot be obtained in inverse perspective? So if you had a language, if you had two languages, and one of the languages was able to talk about all time frames, but the other language could not talk about the past, you would say that that other language is not as good, it's not as developed, it's not as systematic as the language that can talk about all time frames. So the objection to the symbol theory is that linear perspective is the only convention that we have, the only convention that humans have ever come up with where it is a systematic convention. So it's systematic and inverse perspective is not. What does it mean that it's systematic? What that means is that you can draw anything in linear perspective and you can draw it on the picture surface without breaking rules. Every other form of every other convention of drawing, you cannot do that. So inverse perspective, you cannot draw things in inverse perspective without breaking the rules of inverse perspective to represent certain things. So we'll take a look here at the Trinity, also called the Hospitality of Abraham by Rublev. So here we have three angels, and they're sitting on chairs around a table, and they have a footstool that they're resting on. And if you take a look at this picture and start to really study it, you'll notice that certain things just look wrong, right? Certain things are just improperly drawn. So we have that area right there. So either the back part of that footrest is attached to the chair somehow, or it's floating in space, or it's breaking the rules of it being on the ground floor, right, on the ground plane. So something is going weird in both of these footrests. And then the other thing is that if you were to draw these chairs in inverse perspective, where as they recede in the distance, they actually diverge, and you were to draw that table in inverse perspective, where as the edges recede, it actually diverges as well, that means that at some point, you're going to have the edge of a chair occupying the same space in your picture as the edge of a table. And those places are where the artists who were working for rich patrons, who they knew would not pay them unless their picture looked good, resorted to composition and said, you know what? There is no way to solve that problem of the space of the chair and the table not intersecting with each other. So we'll just put an angel there and cover that area. And we'll just put another angel there and we'll cover that area. So we'll just make sure that the areas that are problematic, we'll cover those, because again, we don't have a systematic way of representing everything. So these are the problems that were run into by Rublev when he was drawing three angels around a single table. Those problems were not encountered by Leonardo da Vinci when he was using linear perspective to draw the Last Supper. Here we got 12 apostles, we got Jesus, we got multiple chairs, we got a table, we have tiles on the, or some sort of tile thing on the ceiling. This is definitely not the building that Last Supper actually would have been in. But we have all these things and all of them fit. And none of them are occupying the same space and none of them contradict the rules. And you don't need to cover anything in order to make this picture in linear perspective. And that's also why photography uses linear perspective, because the geometry comes from the sort of natural projection of the light rays, meaning that you don't have to break rules or cover things up because the convention is inadequate in terms of representing everything possible. So perspective seems to have some sort of special status in the sense that it is the only convention thought up so far that is completely systematic, where you can draw anything and it'll make complete sense, whereas inverse perspective fails in the sense that you will draw things that don't occupy the same space in the real world as occupying the same space in your picture. All right, so that was the even better definition. Now we're going to end with our betterer definition. And for this one, we come back to Gibson one more time. And again, this is one of the reasons why when you discuss Gibson, you have to discuss the time. So Gibson 58, Gibson 60, and Gibson 71, very different ideas. It's one of the things I love about Gibson because he was not offended by being wrong. He was completely fine with being wrong as long as it got him closer to the truth. So 1971, where we're going to end up with, Gibson was saying, a picture is a surface so treated. So once again, a picture is a canvas so painted that a delimited optic array to a point of observation is made available. Delimited meaning that it doesn't expand indefinitely the way your environment does. Optic array, we've talked about. Point of observation is where you are looking at that picture. That contains the same kind of information that is found in the ambient optic arrays of an ordinary environment. So we have remnants of that point-by-point definition where, yes, the picture surface is creating an optic array, but now instead of recreating all the information in the optic array, it recreates the same kind of information that is found in the ambient optic arrays of the ordinary environment. It recreates basically the invariants that are found in that ordinary environment. So the core of Gibson's 1971 definition, this is the pictures as information definition. And basically it rests on the idea that a picture is providing you with optical information. A picture is providing you with information that your visual system picks up, and this information specifies the properties of the world that are being represented. So it's the idea again of the visual system, the idea again that the picture is not reproducing the exact ambient optic array, it's not reproducing the perspective structure of the ambient optic array, but it's producing the invariant structure of the ambient optic array. And that's the information that you are picking up from that picture that allows it to represent that image in the real world. So one of the things I love is when I come across psychology and sometimes like really complex psychology ideas from people who are not psychologists, especially if they're people that I very much admire. So one of my favorite comedians of all time was a guy called Mitch Hedberg. Died way too soon, but here's just some of his best, some of his one-liners. Not even his best. If you want to have a good laugh, Google him. He's very dry. He's very interesting, but he'll say things like, "P.S. This is what part of the alphabet would look like if Q and R were eliminated. I tried to throw away a yo-yo. It was effing impossible. I don't have a girlfriend. I just know a girl who would get really mad if she heard me say that. I once saw a forklift lift a crate of forks, and it was way too literal for me." So he once mentioned, unknowingly to himself, a very good example and a very succinct definition of Gibson's pictures as information theory. So we're going to turn to that now, And believe it or not, it's when he was ranting about Swiss cheese.
Swiss cheese is the only cheese you can draw with a pencil and still identify. No other cheese is like that. You can try to draw America with a pencil, but someone's going to think it's cheddar. The Swiss cheese is for sure. That's Swiss. Yes, it is.
All right, so the quality of that was not the greatest. I apologize for that. But once again, he's talking about pictures of information. And he was talking about how Swiss cheese is the only cheese that you can draw with a pencil and a paper, because you can specify the information that is invariant in Swiss cheese with that pencil and paper. So just one more time again, because the audio quality was a little low.
Swiss cheese is the only cheese you can draw with a pencil and still identify. No other cheese is like that. You can try to draw America with a pencil, but someone's going to think it's cheddar. The Swiss cheese is for sure. That's Swiss. Yes, it is.
All right, so what is he basically saying there? Basically saying that Swiss cheese is the only cheese where you can put information in a line drawing that specifies that you're looking at Swiss cheese. So if I was to draw this, and again, this is not a point-by-point projection of anything. Colors are missing, shading is missing. It's a very simple line drawing. But if I was to draw this and I was to say, hey, what do you think that is? People might say, I don't know, it's a slice of cake. It's a piece from a Trivial Pursuit, game. It's a wedge. You might even say, well, is that like a wedge of cheese? That's because the information is not there. But if I showed you this line drawing and I said, what is that? You'd be like, that is Swiss cheese. And that is Swiss cheese for sure. And the idea is that there is information in that picture of Swiss cheese that specifies that invariant relation that we have picked up that specifies Swiss cheeseness in a way that is not specified in the other picture. So when we see a picture of a lion, we recognize it as a picture of a lion because the invariant structure that specifies lioness, lion, not necessarily lionesses. Oh, what am I talking about lions? Tigers. When we see a picture of tigers, I made up my own little language there. I'm going to call this lion from now on. No, when we see a picture of tigers, there's tigeressness in that picture because the invariant relations of what makes a tiger is in that picture. And that's why those 4 pictures of a tiger look like tigers, because they reproduce that information that specifies this is a tiger. This line drawing, simple as it is, reproduces the information that specifies that this is an airplane, reproduces the information that specifies that this is a rigid object with wings that we recognize as an airplane. And that caricature of Ariana Grande and the picture of Ariana Grande both contain the same information that specifies that identity of Ariana Grande. So they both contain that invariant information of identity that we pick up and it specifies to our visual system that you are looking at Ariana Grande. So that is the idea of pictures as information. And pictures work because the invariant relations and the information in the picture is picked up by the observer and specifies what that picture was representing in the real world. And incidentally, I don't have it on a slide here, but this is also one of the reasons why pictures work at different viewpoints. So we mentioned last class that a picture is one of the only things that you can look at where you can be in the wrong position to look at it. So if you actually go to certain frescoes or certain ceiling paintings in Italy that were done during the Renaissance, you will find a disc on the floor, which is the space that you should be at if you want to take a look at that picture from the point of view that it was supposed to be observed at. And you'll get in line and you'll wait your turn and you'll get to that point and you'll look up and you'll say to yourself, wow, that looks super realistic. It looks like the cathedral continues up into heaven, off into the angels, and off into heaven. That is not required for picture perception. We can see this even though we're not at the correct position. The perspective picture of Ariana Grande, the photo, looks fine, looks correct, even though we're not in the correct position. And Gibson's theory of pictures as information can provide an answer to that, because basically what he's saying is that, well, there is information in that picture, and that information is being picked up, and it's the same information regardless of where you are in front of the picture. So if you're off to the side, whatever invariant relations are in that picture are maintained throughout the space in front of the picture. So if you're off to the side, if you're too high above, too low below, off to the other side, it doesn't matter, because the invariant relations, the information that you're picking up is maintained through your changes in position. All right, so I would love it if I could tell you, well, that was the end of picture perception. Well, actually, I kind of wouldn't love it because it's part of my career, but it would be very interesting if I could tell you, well, that's the end of picture perception. You guys know everything that you need to know. We've finished it. You can check out some of the details in other work, but we're good to go. Not the case. There's one last big objection to Gibson's pictures as information definition, and that is metaphoric pictures. And metaphoric pictures and our ability to perceive and understand metaphoric pictures is contradictory to pictures as information, because metaphoric pictures do not contain, by definition, they do not contain the same kind of information that is found in the ambient optic arrays of an ordinary environment. A metaphoric image is, by definition, something that is depicted that does not occur in the actual environment. So, for example, that metaphoric image of ghost lions, that is a depiction of, well, the ghost lions is not something that exists. But here we've depicted something that exists, but we've depicted it in a metaphorical way. So we have real objects in the real world, lions, that we've depicted in a metaphorical way, giant-sized ghost lions, and we readily understand, and we'll see a little bit about this in a future lecture, we readily understand that we're not literally talking about gigantic sky lions. What we're talking about is a metaphorical image, that these lions are the kings of their domain, that everything the sun touches is they rule over, that they're the apex predator, that they're above all. That's what we understand in this picture. And you can contrast that, and again, it's this weird dichotomy that we have in this picture depicted something that does exist in a way that it has never existed. And we're able to do that in pictures. And then we're also able to depict things that do not exist in a way that they would exist if they had existed, if that makes somewhat sense. So we have real objects on the one hand, and we got fictional objects on the other hand. But we got real objects that are drawn in a metaphorical image, and then we have a fictional object that is drawn in a literal image. The idea being that if unicorns existed, that's what a photo of a unicorn would look like. So it's a fictional object, but it's being depicted in a literal way. On the other hand, we got real objects, lions, that are being depicted in a metaphorical way. And again, Gibson's definition of pictures as information cannot explain that, because at no point in the history of our evolution, at no point in our existence in our environment, have we ever come across gigantic ghost lions in the sky. So how is it that when we see that picture, we're like, oh yeah, gigantic ghost lions in the sky? That makes total sense. So that's the kind of currently existing objection to Gibson's pictures as information theory. And that actually is going to be a nice segue into what we're going to cover next time, because one of the last things to really try to get a handle on is how our mind perceives pictorial metaphors. How is it that visual metaphors are perceived? So next time we are going to go over a study that I did with a undergrad student here, Alicia Horvath, and it was an analysis of motions in comic book cover art. So again, motion being depicted in a picture. So very confusing exactly how that might be done. Something is being depicted as moving in a very static image. But how do those metaphors help us understand? How are they used? How are they processed by our visual system? And we're going to see, and this is sort of also a contradiction to Goodman's theory of conventions, we're going to see that pictorial devices, literal devices, literal symbols, if you want to extend it to Goodman's definition, literal symbols are processed by your mind very differently than metaphorical symbols. So literal pieces of information are processed in your mind very differently in a picture than metaphorical pieces of information. But that is just going to be a little pre-credits teaser for what we're going to be doing next time. Any final questions on picture perception before we wrap it up? All right, that is it for today. So next time we will again be taking a look at that study that I did with Alicia Horvath on metaphorical images and how we perceive them. Highly, highly recommend. Give that article a go through before our next meeting if you haven't already. Do the pre-test before our next meeting as well, because we're getting into articles that are a little bit maybe more difficult to read and understand than textbooks. And even if you don't get it on your first pass through, that first pass through is doing a lot of cognitive work that'll help you understand things a lot better when we actually come to the class on that day. So I highly recommend do it. Do the pre-test. Bomb on the pre-test if that's what it takes, because you can always go back and do the pre-test again and get your, and improve your grade. So don't shy away from doing the pre-tests. They're a great way to help you. On that note, we are all done.